Thank you. Is this on? Thank you very much. Let's get everyone seated. We are going to talk about Sharia law. One of my heroes and my, I would say my spiritual mentor is an American imam by the name of Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. And he once said something very interesting to me about Sharia. He said that Sharia is like water, that it takes on the form of whatever vessel it is poured into. And it's a reminder that, in a sense, there is no such thing as Sharia. That Sharia is as diverse and as eclectic as you can imagine. And so in this conversation, we are going to talk particularly about Sadakat's book, Heaven on Earth, which is a marvelous book about the origins, history, diversity, and the lived practice of Sharia in the world. And that will be sort of the taking off point for our discussion here. But we have a wonderful panel of experts, of scholars, journalists, writers, thinkers, who in their own right have either experienced, written about, or thought about Sharia. And so we're going to get the conversation started with Sadakat. And you know, you wrote this marvelous book about Sharia, which makes me want to actually begin this conversation, this discussion, with the simplest of questions, a question that I think a lot of people just take for granted, which is, what is Sharia? What do we mean when we say Sharia?
Sure. Well, I found myself asking the same question a few years back. The best way to answer your specific question, Reza, is to explain the genesis of the book. Because I am, by background, a lawyer. I am Muslim by birth. I regard myself as a Muslim. I've been raised as a Muslim. But I'm a secularist. I'm a human rights lawyer, live in London. And I have written previously a book about Western legal history. And while I wrote that book in New York, I was living in New York during and after September the 11th. And during those years, the 2 years that I was living in New York, everyone was talking about Sharia, everyone was talking about Islam, and very often they were saying some terrible things about it, that it was defined by its attitude towards violence. Obviously, I personally didn't think that was the case, but I was at that point focusing very much on the Western legal tradition. But then my book came out in London in April 2005, and 3 months later we had the bombings in London of July the 7th, where 50 people were killed, again by Muslims, suicidal Muslims, who justified their actions according to Islamic law, who said that this was mandated by divine justice. And it was at that point that I thought to myself, well, there's got to be a book in this. So and so I started to ask around. I began with my father, who, as I've said, is Indian. He's a Muslim. He's Indian born, in fact, born in UP. And I asked him, well, what does the Sharia say about suicide, about killing people? Now, he said, of course, I say of course, but I think it's the view of the overwhelming majority of Muslims that it's forbidden by the Sharia. But I asked him, well, where are these rules? Where is this written down? And he wasn't really able to point me anywhere. I mean, of course, he said in the Quran, and there he pointed to various verses in the Quran which talk about the time of death being for God only to know. But he wasn't able to point me to a specific body of rules called the Sharia. So then I started asking around among friends, both Muslim and non-Muslim, and they were very similar. They didn't know. And I thought to myself, well, if I don't know, I'm a lawyer. If my father doesn't know, who's also a lawyer and has been steeped in Muslim tradition since his birth, if my Muslim friends don't know, then there's got to be something to be said about this. And so that's when I started to write the book. And to cut a very long story short, I don't want to make this answer too long because there's a lot to talk about, but the practices that have been justified as sacred law over the last 1400 years are incredibly diverse. There are, of course there have been amputations, of course there have been beheadings, but one of the very surprising facts that I found, for example, about the Ottoman Empire, the empire that ruled from Istanbul for 500 years, the number of recorded stonings, for example, in the 500 years of Ottoman history is precisely one, just one in 500 years. That isn't to say that others didn't occur, but it is to say that it's not a matter of routine that punishments like this are applied. If one looks at the recent revival of Islamic law, of Islamic criminal law, because actually it's only been over the last half a century that it's really been applied anywhere in the world, Pakistan, Iran, Sudan, Somalia, Nigeria, etc. If one looks at these countries, there are many hardliners who claim that it's incredibly important to apply these sacred penalties, because these are haqūq Allah, these are the rights of God. But if one actually then looks at whether they actually are applied, they're utterly exceptional. A country like Pakistan, it's got stonings on the book, it's got lashes on the book, it's got amputations on the statute books, hasn't applied a single one ever in the last, since 1979 when the Hudud ordinances were first enacted. So that kind of begins to answer what Sharia maybe isn't, but perhaps the best way of answering the question positively, Reza, is to look at its etymology. What Sharia means in Arabic is path, and more precisely, etymologically, in the 7th century, what it meant was a direct path towards water. Which was, of course, a route of considerable importance to a desert people like the Arabs. It was the path that you would take towards salvation, metaphorically. And in my book, I say that the closest English equivalent is the straight and narrow. So it doesn't have a substantive meaning in that sense. What it means, it's the right thing to do. And I think it's very important to begin with that, because people who set themselves against the Sharia, even if they're motivated by very good reasons, human rights friendly reasons, are actually running the risk of losing the argument before they begin, because to a devout Muslim, to many devout Muslims at least, who aren't sensitive themselves to these, to what their interlocutors might mean, to many devout Muslims, an attack on the Sharia amounts to an attack on God himself. So that isn't a sensible way. Even if you are motivated by the best of reasons, that isn't a sensible way to open a debate about whether, for example, there should be stonings, whether there should be beheadings, whether interpretations of Islam are misogynistic or discriminatory. There's another word. The word is fiqh, which means understanding in Arabic. It's also obviously it's got its Urdu Hindi equivalent, fiqh, and that word has always been understood by Muslims to mean the human attempt to follow the precepts of the Sharia. And Muslims have always understood that these questions are human questions which are open to debate. Of course, there have been scholars who, in their own self-interest, have said, no, actually, there's no difference between Sharia and fiqh. They're one and the same. An attack on fiqh is the same as an attack on Sharia. You know, this is what a group like Al-Qaeda would say. It's what the hardline muftis in a country like Pakistan would say, and probably also in Somalia, which Mary's written about. But it's simply not true. If one looks at the history of the interpretation of Islamic law over the last 1400 years, people have been arguing about the meaning of the Sharia. In other words, there've been arguments about fiqh for since at least the 7th, 8th century. And I know Tom has written a lot about this. There are parallels with the arguments that took place over the development of the Talmud, for example, and the process by which one of the sources of Islamic law, the hadiths, the reports about the Prophet's life, the process by which those were written down is itself the subject of great argument, always has been, and it still is today. And it's very, very important that I would say that these two things get conceptually separated, and so I suppose one's talking about. My point is that Sharia itself is understood by Muslims to mean justice, effectively, but the human interpretations of justice, Islamic law or fiqh, are definitely open for interpretation, and they've been understood in 100 different ways over the years.
Now, you bring up two very important points. One, of course, is the difference between Sharia and fiqh, between the concept of divine law and the application of that as jurisprudence. And it's the application, of course, that where many of these problems arise, the draconian punishments, for instance, the difficulties of reconciling these jurisprudential acts with the realities of the modern world and the expectations of human rights, of gender rights, etc., all things that we're going to talk about on this panel. But what was really fascinating, and Tom, I want to throw this question to you in a moment, is that when talking about something like divine law, these inherent contradictions are impossible to get over. On the one hand, if we're talking about divine law, how can there be multiple versions of this? How can there be multiple interpretations of it, which of course is what a lot of conservative, very orthodox scholars and clerics would argue. When in reality, there are. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of knowledge, a lot of research to discover the enormous diversities, the enormous evolutionary steps that Sharia has taken over the last 1400 years. The other thing about divine law, the way divine law is often seen, is that it comes it drops straight from heaven, fully formed, without any need for any kind of cultural context. It has no influences. It's perfect as it is, and all it needs to do, all one needs to do is just simply implement it. But of course, that is a total fantasy, right, Tom? I mean, Sharia, like so much of Islam, has been influenced by countless different cultures, societies in the Near East. You've written about this in your latest book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, absolutely. The idea of divine law, the idea that God is a legislator, is not a cultural given. It's not something you get in China, very obviously, but it is something that arises out of the soil of the ancient Middle East. And it goes right the way back to the time of the pharaohs. Pharaoh speaks, that is equivalent to law. Mm-hmm. What is really distinctive, what changes the game, is what happens in ancient Israel. Because the Israelites, uniquely among the peoples of the ancient Near East, enshrine a God as their legislator. Law comes... God in Israel replaces the Pharaoh, replaces the Oriental king. And that means that a very distinctive civilization emerges there, and a culture develops in which it is taken for granted that you can look to the divine for guidance as to how you should live here on earth. Now, what then happens is that Israel is destroyed, we get Judea instead. That gets conquered by Alexander the Great, and the Greeks come with a rather different understanding of divine law. The Greek understanding of divine law is that it exists naturally within the heart. A divine law is what cannot be written down. A human law is what can be written down. So in a way, it's the polar opposite of the Jewish presumption. And in a sense, there is a dialogue established between these Jewish and Greek notions of divine law. And there is a way in which we can see what emerges as the two religions that we would now call Judaism and Christianity are attempts to negotiate the tension between these Greek and Jewish takes on divine law. And to simplify very, very dramatically, Christianity essentially goes the Greek way. With St. Paul, he says we no longer need the law because we have feeling in the heart. We feel Christ here. And so Christianity becomes a religion in which the notion of divine law is really put to one side. The Jews, particularly the rabbis, construct an entire edifice of law. They come up with the notion of an oral tradition, as well as the written tradition. Moses inherited the written Torah from Mount Sinai, but the rabbis declare that there was also a secret one that was passed down to Joshua and then to the judges and then to the prophets and so on down to the rabbis. And that enables them to construct and to then start writing down in the 5th, 6th, and then into the 7th centuries an entire body of law. And this is the context from which Islam emerges. It is a world in which the nature of divine law has been furiously and ferociously debated, and in which a whole number of different faiths and civilizations are attempting to construct totalizing, almost totalitarian systems. You have the Talmud, you have Zoroastrian frameworks of law, which are also being written down in this period. And interestingly, the Christian Roman Empire, they don't, because essentially of Paul, they can't claim that law comes directly from God, but what they do is to absorb the inheritance of Roman law and to fashion that into a vast totalizing system. So there is a sense in which what emerges as the Muslim Sharia is very much a plant grown from a subsoil that has been well seeded beforehand.
As you would expect, of course, with any kind of law that is meant to negotiate not just the relationship between human beings and God, but the relationship among human beings. You know, a couple of years ago, and at the beginning of the Arab Spring, there was a survey done of Egypt that ruffled a lot of feathers in the West. Apparently, nearly, I think it was in the very high 80s, 80%, 85% of Egyptians said that they wanted Egypt to be run by Sharia. And this, of course, freaked everybody out, because everyone thought, well, you know, if we allow this revolution to continue, then Egypt will become another Iran, etc., etc. But what was fascinating is what was missed in that survey, which is that when people, the vast, vast majority of people in the Muslim world, particularly in this case in Egypt, mean Sharia, when they say Sharia, they don't actually mean what you think they mean. They don't necessarily mean the actual jurisprudential practice of Sharia, the stonings and, you know, the legal prohibitions, etc. What they are referring to is Sharia as a matter of identity. If you live in a country like dictatorial Egypt, in which the law is whatever Mubarak says the law is, Sharia means nothing more than justice. It means a written law, a law that I can point to and say, this is my values. In other words, it's a matter of identity far more so than it is a matter of beliefs and practices. And this brings me to a question that I want to ask Mary. In her travels through Africa, she's done an enormous amount of work in Somalia and also been paying attention to what's been happening, of course, in northern Mali, as most of us have. And that is, there's one thing to talk about Sharia as a divine theoretical law. It's another thing to see it in practice, to try to actually make it part of the societal structure, for good and for bad. And it brings me to this notion that oftentimes when you have these emerging states, these collapsing states, these non-state entities that you know, profess Sharia as the sort of their founding ideals, they're not so much talking about the practice of it, they're talking about the identity of it, how Sharia allows them to express who they are as people. And I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit about your experience, particularly following closely these two states, Mali and Somalia, both of which are dealing with these Islamist movements trying to implant Sharia, and ask you, is that something that you've seen? Is it about a question of who I am as an individual as much as it is about what is right and wrong behavior, etc.?
Yeah, and what's fascinating about...
Is the mic on?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
A little bit louder.
Can you hear me now?
There we go.
That's better. What's fascinating about Mali is that Mali was, until a few months ago, seen as a great African success story in terms of democracy. It was one of the few functioning democratic countries in Northwest Africa. And then very unexpectedly, following a coup, 2/3 of Mali, which is an area about the size of France. An enormous part of the country was taken over by a variety of groups, all of whom absolutely Sharia is their identity. Some of them, such as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which is a group that stretches across the Sahel and the Sahara region, they believe in global jihad. And then there are other Malian radical groups who believe in a more national form of the application of very, very draconian Sharia law. And in what was a very mild Muslim country, there are now regular amputations, stonings, beheadings of people. And this really did take not only the outside world by surprise, but also the people who live in that area. Also, tragically, these people who profess to believe in this kind of Sharia rule have destroyed, in Timbuktu, which is a World Heritage Site, they've destroyed tens of thousands of ancient Muslim documents. Africa's not very good at keeping onto its material culture, and Timbuktu was one of the few places that had such magnificent libraries. Those have been destroyed, and also lots of mosques and shrines and mausoleums are gone forever. It's interesting that the case of northern Mali has provoked the kind of standard Western reaction to the imposition of some kind of Sharia state, I suppose you could call it now, led by France. They're basically trying to bomb these people out of existence, as they've tried in places like Afghanistan. But my feeling is that it's certainly not going to end in the end of that kind of Islam. I don't think that the jihadists, or whatever you want to call them, who've taken over such a big part of Africa, I don't think they really care whether they're in Mali or other parts of that enormous desert region that stretches right into the center of Africa. They'll just melt away from the towns that are being bombed and re-emerge somewhere else. And it is, now if you look at Africa, you can see a near continuous belt of these radical Islamists stretching from Nigeria in the west all the way to Somalia and Kenya in the east. And I'll turn now to Somalia, which is a country about which I've written a book and which I visit often. And the sort of Western approach, again, to dealing with almost the whole country being taken over by a group called Al-Shabaab, which is linked to Al-Qaeda, was slightly different to the one in Mali. America definitely has a hand in it, but it kind of backed an African force to try to get rid of these people. But even though you might read in the press that Al-Shabaab has now vanished, it's absolutely not the case. Al-Shabaab has simply become a regional force. It's very prevalent in places like Kenya, Tanzania, Zanzibar, and Somalia itself is now occupied by foreign forces. So it's not really a solution to dealing with the problem. So,
can I ask you just a follow-up to this question? And I want to get to Ali Asghar, engineer, in a moment. But so you talk about this sort of this crescent, of radical Islamist rule. Is the soil fertile for that? I mean, in other words, Somalians and the people of Mali who are Muslims, who do identify with Sharia, but who are not necessarily promoters of this kind of draconian version of it. Is it something about, is it just that they are forcing this interpretation, or do you think that the soil is something that allows for this kind of interpretation?
Yeah, in some places like Nigeria, for example, there's a very radical group there as well called Boko Haram that is also beheading people, going into churches, throwing grenades, killing dozens of people. And interestingly, in Nigeria, northern Nigeria, Sharia law already exists. And it's interesting that in a place that is seen even by the rest of Nigeria as being quite radical in terms of the way it applies Islam, that isn't seen as radical enough by some groups. In Somalia, this is a question that I still don't know the answer to, because I keep asking Somalis, who are very proud people, they're not afraid of anybody, they're not even afraid of dying. I say, how can you accept this very foreign kind of Islamic identity, when you yourselves have your own form of Islamic practice with your identity, which is linked to Sufi brotherhoods. And some of them say it's because of the Saudis, because after the state collapsed more than 20 years ago, Saudis have been pouring money into Somalia and building mosques and things. But whether that's the answer, I don't know, and I'd love to hear from the other panelists.
Yeah, there's just one thing that I'd like to pick up on that, which is from Mary's book, in fact, and it recalled something that I'd found, that I'd written about Afghanistan, which is that in Somalia, in Mogadishu, you had a group called the Islamic Courts Union taking power in, I think it was 2006, and it took power after a protracted period of civil war, where there had just been complete lawlessness throughout the country. And it came in, and one of the first things it did was conduct an incredibly brutal public execution, where a 16-year-old boy was given permission to execute the killer of his father, so long as he did it in precisely the same way as the killer had executed, had killed his own father. And it was absolutely brutal. If one reads reports about it, it's disgusting. But one has to put that into the context of the fact that it was regarded, and Mary writes about this in her book, it was regarded by ordinary Somalians as a sign that law and order had come back to the country. And to the outside world, we look at that and we see whatever, a head being broken open or a throat being cut, whatever the particular brutality is involved. But to someone who's actually been seeing far, far, far worse for 15 years, it doesn't represent that. It represents the hope, at least, that this is the beginning of the end of that injustice, and actually a period of justice is going to be ushered in. And one saw exactly the same thing with the Taliban in the mid-1990s. The same hopes after a period of after years of warlordism, the Taliban swept to power on the promise that they were going to bring justice. Now, of course, we know what the outcome of that has been. These dreams have turned to dust. The brutality has been, if anything, worse in subsequent years. But again, it's important to recognise that when the word Sharia is used in these contexts, it's sometimes used mistakenly, I would argue, but it's sometimes used as an expression of hope, and it's regarded as something positive.
Well, I would just like to say that I think that it originates in precisely that context, because the context for the original emergence, certainly of the Sunnah and of the Sharia generally, is a Middle East that has been ravaged by superpower conflict, by plague, and then when the Arabs take over, by repeated civil wars and savagery. And the achievement of the lawyers and the scholars who construct a framework of ultimately Islamic jurisprudence is to establish codes and frameworks of behavior that serve to regulate people who previously had tolerated no regulation. Right. And it is that makes it one of the supreme civilizational achievements of world history, and establishes a context that will enable Muslims, wherever they are, to have a framework of authority that is higher than the local warlord.
Right. This goes back exactly to the survey in Egypt, that the majority of those who said they wanted Sharia meant that they want a concrete sense of the law, something that they can point to, that exists, that they can appeal to. Interestingly, a majority of Egyptian women said that they wanted Sharia, which I think would also come as a surprise to a lot of people, because one of the biggest perceptions about Sharia is that it is inherently anti-women. Ali Asghar, engineer, you've written a lot about the fact that that goes against the very concept of the rights and privileges that Islam and the Prophet Muhammad gave to women, and that in fact the Sharia can be a form of liberation for women. Could you speak to that a little bit?
You see, I dare say this here, that Islam is the only religion, first religion I would say, the first religion which gave rights to women in a concrete manner. It recognized women's individuality. It recognized women's dignity. It recognized women's role. rather different roles. So it is far, far from true that Sharia oppresses women. Yes, Sharia as it is practiced, as it is interpreted, as it is understood, certainly oppresses women. So I often say I am a strong defender of Sharia and fighter against Sharia. So this contradiction I explain by this way, that Sharia as it should be. Now, as it was pointed out by other speakers also, that Sharia is a human approach to divine intention. To absolutize it and to maintain that Sharia is divine is not correct. Sharia has lot of human elements. Not only that it has human elements, it also has socio-cultural context. For example, Islam came in Arabia. Many people do not know, rather very few people know, that Sharia as it is today, 75% of its content is derived from Arab society, from Arab traditions. Be it nikah, be it divorce, be it inheritance, in every way, meher, concept of meher, all that comes from socio-cultural context of Arabia of the time. What Holy Prophet did, and fortunately today is the birthday of Prophet. We are talking of Sharia on his birthday today. So what Prophet Muhammad did was to humanize it, to purge it of its oppressive nature, gave it a form which can be acceptable beyond Arab society, beyond given time at that time. So unfortunately common Muslims think, and I don't blame them if they think that it is purely divine. But what is tragic is our ulama keep on making such declarations that Sharia is divine and so cannot be changed. Sharia has been changed in number of phases in our history, and in the beginning it had 100 schools of Sharia, of which 5 schools survived in Sunni Islam and 4 schools survived in Shia Islam. So the divergence of schools itself shows that there are different interpretations. One tragedy which Islam met with was that it passed through feudal age and it was completely feudalized. And it is feudalized approach to Quran and Hadith that made Sharia appear anti-women. And ulama began to claim that whatever we have formulated is final and divine and cannot be changed. Every student of Islam knows that there is place for ijtihad in Islam. Ijtihad means creative reinterpretation, revisiting the law which have been formulated by this. So women, if you go through Quran carefully, the entire discourse in Quran about women is about their rights. An entire discourse about men in Quran is about their duties towards women. Now this is never highlighted. That is never brought to the notice of people. What Sharia does as it is practiced today is what are the duties of women. She should be a good wife, she should serve her husband, she should treat her husband as her sartaj, that is the crown of her head, and so on and so forth. Whereas Quran does not mention even once, does not advise women even once to serve her husband. In fact, Quran does not use words husband and wife at all. It uses the word couple. It never uses the word, because husband indicates authority. The word for husband in Arabic is Baal. Show me, except at 3 places in Quran, the word Baal has not been used at all. Because Baal was the name of a god among Arabs. So using word Baal would mean giving status of God to husband. And Quran uses the word zawj, which means couple. And Quran says, وَخَلَقْنَاكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا, that we have created you in pairs, in couples. So both are absolutely equal. And Quran makes the statement, وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ, because women were oppressed in pre-Islamic society. Women, they demanded only duties from women. So Quran said, لَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ, they don't demand duties from them, they have equal rights. So this bold statement of Quran, Maulana Azad, a famous scholar from India who wrote a commentary on Holy Quran, says that this is revolutionary declaration of equality of men and women in Islam. So what do we want? But despite that, we know how women are treated. Polygamy is treated as privilege for men. It is far, far from that. Quran clearly advises that وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا فَوَاحِدَةً, that if you fear you cannot do justice, justice is very, very crucial for evolving Sharia law. So if you cannot do justice, marry only one. And again, Quran makes another statement that even if you are very greedy to do justice, even then you could not do justice. Do not leave first wife hanging in the air. Now with these statements, how can you say that polygamy is a privilege? Polygamy is a responsibility rather than privilege, because war widows were taken care of, and in that context Quran advised, if you cannot do justice to women otherwise, marry them and do justice. And even after marriage you cannot do justice, marry one. So polygamy was very common in those days, throughout the world, not only in among Arabs, it was common throughout the world. But when Quran permitted it with so many conditions, so that women do not lose their identity, do not lose their dignity, do not lose their individuality. So it is.
I want to make sure that we get to the Q&A as well. But that's a very good point. Do you want to just very quickly comment on that, and then we'll get to the audience?
Sure. No, it is very much just by way of a comment, which is that it's very important to historicize this the point that Ali Asghar Saab was making, which is that the Muslim scholars themselves in the 8th century and the 9th century, when they first started to comment on the Quran and when they first started to draw up their ideas about Islamic law, made a point about the relative egalitarianism of Islam. In the context of women, it was pointed out that in the period before Islam, the Jahiliyyah, the period of ignorance, girls were allowed to be killed, where infanticide was permitted after birth. And there were other points made about egalitarianism, the fact that slavery it was permitted in the Quran, but emancipation was held out as one of the holiest things that someone could do. And the point about that isn't that these things were true about the period before Islam. Who knows? This is a period which is shrouded in darkness, as Tom's written a lot about. But the point is that Muslim scholars themselves in the 8th and the 9th and the 10th centuries were holding this out as an aspect of Islam which was to be admired. That egalitarianism between men and women, and that emancipation, manumission of slaves was something that was valuable. These were things which Muslims themselves held out as important. And if one looks at subsequent periods of history, for example, the Ottoman Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries, Western travellers to those countries regarded with some, quite often regarded with some surprise the relative ease of sexual morals that existed in Muslim countries, and particularly in the 19th century. That's what Orientalism is all about. Again, one doesn't need to go into the truth or the falsehood of those allegations, simply to say that these are, there's been a great diversity of this as a matter of history, and possibly if we have time, maybe Mary could say something about what the situation in Africa, I don't know.
There's a lot to talk about, but I do really want to make sure that we get to the questions in the audience, and I bet you that a lot of these questions are going to be easily addressed by some of the things that we want to say right now. So I actually don't know where the mics are. Is there? Oh, so yes. So just raise your hand, and then and please make your question as short and succinct as possible, and please remember that a question begins with a question word and ends with a question mark.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, I have two questions. The first one is that in Central Asia part, women are not allowed to enter in mosque. What do you think? Who is responsible for such cause? And the second question is, in chapter 9 of Quran, in verse 111, it is written that Allah hath brought from the believers their lives and their wealth, because the garden will be theirs. They shall fight in the way of Allah and slay and be slain. So Sharia law says that we are, kind of relating this verse to practice, and the people, some certain group people, kill other, and they say that we are justifying this verse. So what do you think? Is it like correct, or there should be a modification in it?
Does somebody want to speak to the question of women, Asghar?
You see, there is nowhere written in Quran that women cannot enter mosques. It is men under certain circumstances who enforce this ban. Now, Kaaba is the holiest mosque of Muslims. Men and women perform Hajj together. They pray together. They stand in one line and pray. Now, there is famous hadith of the Prophet that don't stop female servants of Allah from entering mosques. Now, despite that, if they ban the entry, saying that it would cause sexual provocation if they enter the mosque, there is something wrong with men. I mean, even in presence of God, they cannot control their sex. So, where else would they control? So, this is totally wrong, and women must be allowed. And Prophet asked one woman to lead prayer in her house. So, there is no ban, not only entering the mosque, but women can even lead prayer.
Great.
Mixed congregation.
And Tom, do you want to answer that?
I guess my answer would be slightly different. I think the basis of what we've been saying, particularly of Sadakat's wonderful book, is that Islam is not a monolith, and I don't think it makes sense to think of there being something called Islam which is absolute. It is a compound of different traditions. It is a dialogue between people in the present, and the many, many traditions that the Islamic jurisprudence has generated. And ultimately, it goes back to the fact that the Quran, like any sacred scripture, is full of contradictions. Yes, you can use the Quran to preach the equality of men and women. Equally, you can use it to insist that men and women are very different. You can use it to demonstrate that Islam is a religion of peace. You can use it to demonstrate that it is a religion of war. And when you throw in the hadiths as well, there are many, many tensions and contradictions between what the Quran says and what the hadiths say. And so the process of how you negotiate that, it comes down to scholarship, it comes down to tradition, but it also comes down to the cultural context in which people are reading it and the gut instinct that lies in the heart of each individual believer.
Yes. Next question.
Yes, we have a gentleman here. We have a lot of questions to get to. We'll do our best. Please stand up, sir. Please stand up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This question is for Mr. Kadri. You mentioned that you are a devout Muslim and that many other Muslims are also devout. The question was, is the book considered literally to be the word of God? Literally, or is it only metaphorically considered the word of God?
Well, I mean, that's been a matter which has been up for dispute in Islam since the 8th century, since the 8th and 9th centuries. There was a famous dispute between the Mutazilites and the traditionalists in the 8th century, which turned on precisely that, whether the Quran existed independently of God, or whether it was something that was itself divine. And there isn't an answer to that. I mean, obviously the as a devout Muslim, one has to believe that the Quran is the product of revelations. But on the other hand, it clearly is also something which contains contradictory verses, as Tom has mentioned. And there was an entire theory of naskh, which was developed in the 8th and 9th centuries, the theory of abrogation, which explains how the verses are to be understood by human beings on the earth. Basically, the idea is that it's too complex otherwise to be understood. And the theory of naskh, for example, going back to the first question in relation to jihad, but there are a couple of particularly bloodthirsty verses which explain how Muslims should react to, should fight against paganism, should fight against the Jahiliyyah. But there are also innumerable verses which talk about peace. In the 9th century, one scholar said there are 124 verses which contradicted the verse of the sword, for example. Another one said there are 140 verses which contradicted the verse of the sword. Now, if the Quran is the word of God, then the fact that there are contradictions there means that all that we can do as human beings is attempt to resolve those contradictions. Nothing beyond that can be done. It's pointless simply saying the Quran is the divine word of God and that's it. Because the whole point is that we are human beings and we read the word of God and we understand it. And if we perceive contradictions, and if different people perceive contradictions in different ways, then they have to be resolved by human beings.
And it has always been very striking how many of the suicide bombers and the terrorists who feature so prominently really do seem staggeringly ignorant of the Quran and Islam.
It is.
To Sadakat, you talked about theory and practice, and then you talked about manumission of slaves. The Prophet did free some slaves, but then there is the issue of slavery in Islam, the Janj rebellions and the Habshis. And there is a new book, Christian Slaves and Muslim Masters, and it argues that there was even more slave trade by the Arabs than the Atlantic slave trade. The reason that there is no trace now of these slaves in the Arab world is because they castrated their slaves. So it was even in some ways more brutal than the slavery in America. So in this context, how would you say theory is important or practice is important? Thank you.
Go ahead. Yeah, I can say a little bit about that in the African context. Some African countries that are predominantly Muslim, like Senegal, Mauritania, Mali, they still basically have slaves, and there's words for them, even though it's denied. And whether that's, quite often that's to do with traditions that predate Islam. But then you also have the case of somewhere like Somalia, where Al-Shabaab, which says that it is practicing true Sharia law, they basically enslave young women as battlefield wives. I think you could describe the way that they recruit young teenagers and people even younger than teenagers as their suicide bombers, showing them actually Bollywood movies and telling them that that is what you will get. That's the paradise. That's people who blew themselves up last month. They sent these videos, and that's what paradise is like. You could describe those people as slaves as well.
I think there's a massive paradox around the relationship between slavery and Sharia. The Arabs they conquer a great empire, and in the ancient world, when conquerors get an empire, they get slaves. That is part of the benefit of it. And so the Arab armies, when they conquer the Near East and then North Africa, they are like the blades of a plough, turning up and churning previously settled communities. And so people who are of a Zoroastrian background, of a Jewish, of a Christian background, they are brought back to the Near East. And they are used as slaves by their Arab masters in the great garrison cities like Kufa and Basra that grow up. Now what happens is that they start reading the scriptures of their Arab masters and pointing out the contradiction in the fact that their masters are treating them as slaves when the messenger that they are talking about, the prophet, has said that all people must be equal. And so they slaves and the descendants of their slaves contribute towards the construction of the hadiths of the Sunnah. You see, I personally do not think that many of the hadiths authentically go back to Muhammad. I think that they reflect the cultural presumptions and traditions of the various people who have been enslaved and brought to the Middle East. But in my terms, that is what makes it so startling as a human achievement, because essentially it is turning the ideological weapons of the conquerors against them and constructing a framework in which slaves and the descendants of slaves can have a greater degree of dignity than they had previously had.
Sure, just very quickly, putting on my hat now as a human rights lawyer, it's important to recognise that around the world there isn't a Muslim country in the world that openly justifies slavery. They've all signed up to the Anti-Slavery Convention, the United Nations Anti-Slavery Convention. The relevance of that isn't that slavery doesn't exist, because we've heard from Mary that it does in practice exist in several countries, and there's constantly news reports about de facto slavery. Even in London, one hears about Muslim households quite often of rich Arabs where slaves are being held. The important thing, though, is that it's not something which any Muslim state holds itself out as doing, and it's not something that any Muslim, I would say, says that they're proud about doing. One could look at the Quran and read it, take a particular literalist view of certain ayats, of certain verses, and say, well, actually, of course, it implies that slavery is a continuing institution. But I would argue that there's another interpretation, and this is the argument that the overwhelming majority of Muslims in the world would hold, that there's another interpretation, which is that manumission, emancipation, freedom are far more consistent with God's purposes, and it's that argument which is prevalent in the Muslim world, and which is quite properly prevalent in the Muslim world, I would argue.
So, very quickly, Ali Asghar, and then I want to get one more question, preferably from a female questioner, please. Go ahead.
You see, slavery, it is often pointed out that Muslims practice slavery. Yes, they did. But Quran does not encourage slavery at all. In Quran there are two types of verses, contextual and normative. Now the context of Arabia was such that slavery could not be abolished in one stroke. So what Quran did, it adopted gradual approach, that it encouraged emancipation of slaves for various acts. If you cannot fast for 30 days, you emancipate a slave. If you have committed a sin, you emancipate a slave. Prophet himself set a concrete example by emancipating his own slave Zaid and married him off to one of the important women of Arabia, giving the message that a slave has same dignity as anyone else. Bilal, who was appointed to give azan, which was very important function. So he gave it to Bilal, who was from Habsha, a slave. So these examples clearly show how anti-slavery Prophet was. But in history, it's a practice, it's a different thing. You always have to, I mean, you can't have everyone like Muhammad. You have weak men and weak women, and that is why it happens. So traders were there who wanted to make profit. So how can we blame Islam for that? So Islam is stood, and Quran clearly says in one of the normative verses, contextual was that it reluctantly permitted slavery, but normative verse says وَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam, that we have given equal honor and dignity to all children of Adam, not only Muslims,
Yes,
but all children of Adam.
Yeah, so stop the presses, the devotees of a religion and don't actually follow the principles of that religion. Yes.
Esteemed panel, as a young woman and a Muslim, I love the idea of interpreting it not only at a cultural level but also at an individual level. I'd just like you to comment on how we could go about that in terms of your research and your literature. How do we make it legally also sustainable, something that's systematic and a way of life, if we were to follow?
Very, very good question to end on. So I'll just let everyone just speak for maybe 1 or 2 minutes. Actually, not even that, 1 minute, and then we'll conclude.
Well, it's a massive question. I mean, I'm not really sure what the answer is. It's something which depends on each individual society that one lives in. I mean, there's certain things that one can do and that one should be doing in the United Kingdom, for example, which would be completely irrelevant and inappropriate in the Indian context. I mean, I think it is important to get a handle of the issue. And thinking, for example, about sexual equality, one has seen, because of recent tragic events in India, that the violence against women is not a phenomenon which is uniquely Muslim by any means. And it's I can't answer for you how one should address the situation in India. One has to operate through the structures that exist, and I know from travelling around in India that the Muslim institutions themselves are quite often close to women, or at least are not welcoming to the approach to women. But all that one can do is argue one's case and push forward and know that there are people all over the world who think the same way, and everyone has their own struggle in that sense.
Yeah, I would agree with Sadakat, and I also feel that even in countries where, like Somalia, they recently passed a new constitution, and the new constitution has lots of things about women. They've even banned female genital mutilation, which is practiced by about 99.9% of women, and it's done in the name of Islam. But I don't think that having it in the constitution or as a law is actually going to change anything on the ground when you see Somalis in London sending their daughters back home on holiday to be circumcised. So I have no answers for you, I'm afraid, but certainly putting it in the law and in the constitution, unless it's very, very ferociously followed by those who impose the law, I don't see how that's going to make a difference.
Well, I'm not a Muslim, so I'm perhaps not qualified to offer you advice, but from my perspective, what I find most admirable about the Islamic intellectual tradition is where it questions and doubts. And if I were a young woman, I would definitely want to question the right of old men to be allowed to tell me what to do.
You see, in order to reinterpret, first thing one requires adequate scholarship. Without scholarship, you cannot do that. You must know Arabic language, and I always advise women that some of them should learn Arabic language, and also its usage before the Holy Prophet and during the time of Holy Prophet, because certain words used in Quran have been interpreted in various ways. So if you want to really go at the root, you must know that word, how it originated, how it was used by Arab poets, and how it was used in Quran. Then only you can really understand the real divine intention. As I said, Sharia is nothing but human approach to divine intention. Divine intention has been expressed through human language. So human language, you will have to master it. Then only you have right to reinterpret and understand and put it before the world.
Very good. Ali Asghar, engineer, Tom Holland, Mary Harper, Sadakat Kadri. I'm Reza Aslan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so, so much. Thank you to all our panelists. We'd love to present you with a scarf. And we do have all 4 authors who will be going over to the author signing desk, which is just behind the far pillar. Please don't come and crowd them around the stage. We'd love to take them over and you can discuss things, have photographs, keep debating. I know there were a lot of questions we didn't get to. I'm so sorry to those we weren't able to get to. So thank you so much. I think we want a quick photograph if that's possible. Will you come here? Just for a quick photo? And Reza has to go. Okay, we have.
You're going to have to take me to the next.
Where is it? Harper? Okay, that's the big one. Would you mind